If you're losing gunfights, the issue might just be your settings. A lot of people are more than likely running the game on default settings, which is putting them at a big disadvantage. But with a few minor tweaks and adjustments, you can get smoother frame rates, better visual quality, and more responsive aim. And in this video, I'll be showing you the exact settings you'll need to change to make a real difference in your gameplay. So I'll quit wasting time and get straight into the video. So we're going to start with the graphics quality settings really quick, and if you're running higher tier hardware like a 9800X3D or a high tier Intel CPU with a 4080, 4090, or even a 5070 Ti or above, I would definitely recommend setting most of your settings to low. I personally like to set texture filtering to overkill, just because it gives me better visual quality and it's not really intense on my hardware, but it is personal preference, so I would recommend setting it to whatever works for you. Otherwise, I would recommend setting local light and shadow quality and shadow filtering to a higher setting just so you can see enemy shadows a bit better. That way, if you do see enemy shadows, you can catch them off guard and get the jump on them before they can get the jump on you. For high fidelity objects amount, you'll see in the description that it says it affects sounds, which basically means it affects how audio works depending on what quality you have the settings set to. So if you're having trouble rating footstep or vehicle audio, I would definitely recommend messing around with this setting to see what works best for you. If you're running mid to low tier hardware, I would recommend mixing your settings around depending on how much they impact your hardware. So for settings like effects quality, which have a high impact on your CPU and your GPU, you're going to want to set this to a lower setting just so you don't run into bottlenecks. And it's kind of the opposite for settings that don't really impact your hardware as much. So something like lighting quality, you can set to a higher setting. If you have a setting like this set to low, your GPU isn't going to be doing as much, which will end up causing your CPU to bottleneck. Unfortunately, it is a bit hard to get into all the details with mid to low tier hardware, so if you're having trouble, you can always look up benchmarks depending on what hardware you use. I would recommend setting it to something that lets you see into dark interiors pretty easily from the outside, and vice versa. For UI brightness, it doesn't really matter, it's just personal preference. And for sharpness, I would recommend setting it to anywhere between 60 and 75, just so enemies stand out a bit better without making the game look over-sharpened and just hard to look at overall. For your advanced settings, I would recommend keeping your fixed resolution scale at 100 just so it matches whatever your monitor's resolution is at. And for your frame limiters, it's kind of just preference. I have mine on because my refresh rate is a bit on the lower side, and with higher frame rates I get a lot of ghosting and screen tearing, so keeping my frame rate around my monitor's refresh rate really helps avoid screen tearing and ghosting. Really quick, I'm going to avoid the low latency setting just so we can talk about DLSS and frame generation. Both of these settings are going to increase your input latency, but if you were to use something like frame generation, you're going to notice a lot of artifacting and ghosting because the setting is injecting artificial frames in between real frames. But for DLSS, you don't really need to run it with higher tier hardware because you're already getting so many frames. But if you want to get as much performance as possible, you could turn this on and set it to performance or ultra performance. If you're running mid to low tier hardware though, I would definitely recommend turning this on and setting it to quality or balanced. It is important to note that if you're using a 30 or 20 series NVIDIA GPU, the DLSS performance or ultra performance quality is going to make your overall visual quality a bit worse. Which is why it's important to run the balanced or quality preset, just to avoid any softness around players or objects. For the performance overlay, I do have it set to simple, and if you also have this set to simple, you'll probably notice that you'll have multiple frame counters. And if you do, you're going to want to keep an eye on the CPU frame counter, because that's your actual frame rate in-game. Unfortunately, I don't have a config at the ready, but you could look up the freely config and get everything you need for this counter. For your camera settings, I would recommend setting your field of view to 100 at the least, just so you can see your surroundings a bit better. It is important to note that if you set your field of view higher than 100, the recoil will feel less intense, but enemy players are also going to appear a bit smaller, which is going to make them harder to aim at. So if you want to increase your field of view, I would recommend setting it between 100 and 110, because that's usually a good sweet spot to where enemies aren't too small and the recoil doesn't feel too intense. For the vehicle third-person field of view, I have it set to 83 just so I can see my surroundings a bit better when I'm driving around, but that is personal preference. It doesn't really matter what you have it set to. For weapon field of view, I would recommend setting it to wide just so your weapon appears smaller while in ADS, which will then let you see your surroundings a bit better while you're aiming. For the rest of the camera settings, I would recommend turning weapon and world motion blur off completely, as well as turning off chromatic aberration, vignette, and film grain. Otherwise, I would recommend turning your camera shake amount down to 25 just so your camera isn't moving around so much while you're sprinting, which will make your visual quality a bit better. And I would recommend turning on reduced sprint camera bobbing. This is going to help with visual quality as well, but this will also help if you're prone to motion sickness. And real quickly, let's go over the controller settings. If you've watched my videos before, you'll know that I'm not a controller player, so I'm just going to go over the basics. Since Battlefield 6 is a pretty high-paced game, I would recommend setting your sensitivity as high as you're comfortable using. If you're running a lower sensitivity and you're having trouble tracking enemies at closer ranges, what I would recommend is slightly increasing your sensitivity and getting used to it for the next couple days, and increasing it a little bit more, getting used to it, and then so on and so forth. Your vertical aim ratio is going to affect how fast you can look up and down as opposed to looking left and right. As you can see, my base setting is set to 56, which means if I'm looking up and down a controller, my sensitivity is going to be half as fast as it would be if I was looking left or right. Ideally, you'll want this set to 100 just so your aim is consistent as possible in any situation, but there's nothing wrong with messing around with this setting and seeing what works best for you. I would recommend turning uniform infantry aiming on just so your aim remains consistent no matter what FOV you're using, and I would recommend setting your zoom sensitivity coefficient to 0 just so it's not moving faster than it should be while you're in ADS. If you scroll down to the zoom settings, you'll notice that there's this setting right here, which is what actually affects your aim sensitivity while zoomed in. So if you have this set to 100 and you have your zoom sensitivity coefficient set to 100, you're pretty much just doubling the speed of your ADS sensitivity. Your aim assist and aim assist slowdown is a bit tricky. I would recommend keeping your aim assist slowdown set to 100 just so you can avoid overcorrecting while you're snapping onto targets, but your aim assist is a little bit different. Let's say you're aiming at a target and another enemy runs across your screen, which causes your reticle to go off the person you're aiming at. If something like this were to ever happen, I would recommend slightly lowering your aim assist until you find what's comfortable for you. Your aim input curve is also going to be a bit tricky, mostly because they don't give you accurate descriptions of what they do. The standard aim curve is going to slow your sensitivity slightly when you make minor inputs with your thumbstick, which helps with micro adjusting. But the more you move your thumbstick, the faster your sensitivity is going to accelerate, which is going to help with looking around quickly and snapping onto targets. The linear aim curve is going to be a 1-to-1 correlation between your input and your sensitivity acceleration. So if you were to move your thumbstick halfway towards its boundary, you'll look around in-game at half your sensitivity. The dynamic aim curve is going to work a little bit like the standard curve. So if you make small inputs with your thumbstick, your sensitivity is going to be a bit slower. If you move it about halfway towards the edge of the boundary, it's going to move a lot quicker. But if you move your thumbstick all the way to the edge of the boundary, it's going to slow down a little bit, which will help a lot with overcorrecting. As for the rest of these aim curves, which are based on different games, they're pretty much going to work the same as the standard aim curves in their respective games. For keyboard and mouse controls, I'm really not going to tell you what to use as it's all personal preference, but I will say you should definitely turn on mouse raw input, just so your sensitivity isn't affected by Windows acceleration or pointer speed. For mouse and keyboard settings, I'm really not going to tell you what to do as it's all personal preference, but I would definitely recommend turning on mouse raw input, just so your sensitivity isn't affected by Windows pointer speed or acceleration. For all your volume settings, it's also personal preference. If you're hard of hearing, I would recommend turning your master volume up, and if your ears are sensitive, I would recommend turning it down a little bit. I will say though, you should definitely turn down the Commander VO volume, as this will overpower the rest of the in-game audio and cover up any enemy footsteps you could be hearing. For the hit indicator sounds, it's personal preference. You can turn it on or off depending on what you like. And for the sound configuration, I unfortunately don't have anything good to say. The audio is pretty bad overall in the game, and even to this day I'm still testing out different configurations to see what works best. For the stereo balance, I would recommend keeping the stereo balance at 0, just so you don't hear anything from the left side of your headphones on the right and right to left. And with the tinnitus settings, I would recommend turning them as low as possible whether or not you're affected by tinnitus, as this will overpower the in-game audio as well. Next up is the HUD settings. Now all these basic settings are just personal preference, you can set them to whatever you like, but the Sovis filter needs to be turned on. That is non-negotiable. The Sovis filter is going to change the lighting and contrast on players, which makes them a lot easier to see. So if you're having trouble seeing enemies at any range, this is going to be the setting you want to turn on. The advanced settings, on the other hand, are going to be a bit tricky. For the big map opacity, I would recommend setting it anywhere between about 80 and 90, just so you can still see what's going on when you have the overhead map open. For your kill feed, you're going to want the show kills made by setting set to all, just so you can gather information from all around the map during a match. And for the kill feed icons, you can have this on or off, it doesn't really matter. If you have it on, you're going to see weapons in the kill feed, and if you have it off, you're going to see the names of the weapons in the kill feed. For the ping notifications, you can set it on or off depending on what you want. If you have it set on, it just means you're going to get the ping notification in the kill feed. So if you want less clutter, you can keep it off. If you want to gather as much information as possible, you can turn it on. And for this ping notifications other setting, it's pretty much just the same thing but for RedSec, so you can just do whatever you want with that. The world log is also for RedSec only, so you can do whatever you want with these settings. And for the squad list, do whatever you want. Like, it doesn't really matter. If you have it turned off, it's just gonna hide the names of your squad mates, and it's gonna slightly decrease the size of your squad mates' health bars. For the vehicle HUD colors, I would recommend keeping the same as they're all pretty easy to see already, but if you're colorblind or you just want them to be even easier to see, you can change them if you want. But the icon settings are going to be the most important of all. The icons and indicator settings are just going to affect the brightness and transparency of neutral or friendly icons, so I would recommend keeping it anywhere between 30 and 50. For the objective icons, I like to set the icon scale to 90 and the opacity to 75, just so they're not in the way when I'm looking around for enemy players. And the same thing goes for the zoomed and occluded settings. The zoomed setting affects how transparent the objective icons are while you're in ADS, so I would recommend setting them anywhere between 10 and 25, just so they're not in the way while you're aiming at a target. For the occluded opacity, I also like to set them to around 10 or 25, just so the more distant objective icons aren't in the way when I'm looking around for enemy players. For the friendly and squad icons, I like to keep the scale and opacity set to around 75, and the zoomed opacity set to around 30. Unfortunately, the revive icon opacity is still bugged. If you don't know about this bug, it pretty much just makes it to where the base opacity doesn't matter at all, and the zoomed opacity is what really affects the base opacity. So unfortunately, you do need to have this set to a higher value. But anything between about 20 and 40% opacity is still more than enough whether or not you're zoomed in. For the enemy icons, I would recommend keeping it at 100% so you can easily identify enemy targets. And for neutral icons, I would recommend keeping the scale and the opacity set to 100, and setting the zoomed opacity between 10 and 20%. For the ping marker icons, I would recommend keeping the scale between 95 and 105, just so you don't miss out on friendly or squad pings. And I would recommend keeping the base opacity around 70 to 80, and the zoomed opacity between 10 and 20. The aim-based icons are also a bit tricky, mostly because the descriptions don't accurately portray how they work. The peripheral zone size is going to further affect how transparent icons are as they get closer to the center of your screen. So I like to keep this set to around 50% just so I can easily see icons at the edge of my screen and I don't mistake teammates for enemies. The center scale, on the other hand, is going to affect the speed at which the transparency increases. So think of it as a circle right at the center of your screen. If you have it set to around 35 like I do, the circle is going to be a bit smaller and the transparency is going to increase at a slower pace. But if you have it set to something higher like 80 or 90 or 100, the transparency is going to increase a lot faster. The peripheral and central opacity settings are going to further affect your base opacity settings for icons. So I would recommend keeping the peripheral opacity set to 100 so icons are easier to see at the edge of your screen, and setting your central opacity between 35 and 45 just so icons aren't getting in the way when you're looking around for enemies. And the zoom settings are going to work the exact same as the first four settings, except while you're in ADS. So I would recommend setting them anywhere between 20 and 40, just so they aren't getting in the way while you're aiming down sights. For your minimap settings, they are mostly just preference. I would recommend setting the size as small as possible while still staying readable, just so you can keep gathering information without having any trouble. And I would recommend setting the background opacity between 75 and 90, just so enemies don't accidentally get covered by your minimap. For the cone and cone edge opacity, you can do whatever you want with these. I have them set to the base values because they don't really negatively affect anything on the minimap. For the view rotation, you can have it on or off. If you have it on, the minimap is just going to rotate as you look around. But if you have it off, your minimap is going to stay on a fixed position and only your player ping on the minimap will move around. For interior zoom, I would recommend keeping it off just in case there are any enemies running around outside that might come into your building. And I would recommend setting all the view distances as high as possible while still remaining readable. I like to keep the on-foot distance set to 160 meters, the ground vehicle distance set to 250 meters, and the air distance set to 1,000 meters. But again, you can do whatever you want with these three settings. You could also turn the compass on or off, it doesn't really matter, but I do like to have it on in case I'm playing with friends, that way I can give them better information. For the crosshair opacity and intensity, I would recommend keeping both of these settings at 100, just so your crosshair is easy to see in any situation. For the crosshair color, you can do whatever you want with it for the most part. I like to keep it white just because I can see it just fine in most situations, but if you want to make sure you can see it in brighter areas, you can set it to a bright pink or a bright green. And the same thing with the custom reticle color. If you do have it on, you can do whatever you want with it, but I would recommend setting it to a bright red, a bright yellow, or a bright green. The crosshair thickness is also personal preference. The thick and default settings are pretty much the same, it just affects the outer rim of your crosshair. But the thin setting makes every bit of the crosshair a bit smaller, the dot in the center and the 4 lines, so you can do whatever you want with this. I would recommend turning infantry crosshair projection on. That way if you're running around, jumping, or diving, it's going to stay right at the center of your screen. And again, the hit indicators are personal preference. If you feel like the indicators are getting in the way, you could turn down the opacity a little bit just so you can see a bit better while in ADS. And you can turn down the intensity a little bit just so they aren't as bright. And besides that, you can do whatever you want with the hit colors. I like to keep all the colors the same for the most part, except for the headshot indicator. I like to change the headshot color just to differentiate when I'm hitting body shots or headshots, but it doesn't really matter. If you have the hit indicator numbers on, I would recommend setting the opacity between 40 and 60% just so they aren't as intrusive. I would also recommend setting the horizontal offset to 50 and the vertical offset to 80 just so the numbers are below your reticle and they aren't getting in the way at all while you're in ADS. So that's about it for the video. Whether or not you're a competitive player, these settings are going to give you the best performance possible. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful, then consider dropping a like and subscribing to the channel to keep up with the best tips, tricks, and breakdowns in Battlefield 6. I also stream from time to time on this channel and on Twitch, so drop a follow over there as well. But with that out of the way, I'll see you in the next video.